Kia ora koutou. I'm Murray Bruce. I'm the director of the Helen Clark Foundation. Welcome to today's webinar on social cohesion in New Zealand in 2026. A few notes before we jump into today's webinar. Our foundation has helped publish a book edited by Professor Emeritus Peter Davis, in which 20 of New Zealand's top thinkers examine a wide range of challenges facing our country in the 2020s, including climate change, fiscal pressures, the cost of living, infrastructure backlogs, the housing crisis, and many others. Importantly, the book also proposes constructive solutions to these structural challenges. Helen Clark has written a foreword for the book and will join Jack Tame on Q&A on TV1 this Sunday morning at 9 a.m. to discuss its findings. That book is now available for pre-order at dunmore.co.nz. My colleague Victoria will post a link in the comments section. And if you're a member of our foundation, you'll be able to purchase this book at a significant discount via a code we'll email this afternoon. If you're not a member of our foundation, we'd love to have your support as we grow our non-partisan evidence-based think tank. Membership is affordable and registration is a quick and easy process via the link also being posted to the comment section. Finally, if you're not already signed up for our next webinar, we hope you can join us on Monday, 29 June at midday when, with Todd McClay and Damien O'Connor, we'll have a current and former Minister of Trade reflecting on New Zealand's cross-partisan approach to trade policy. And as we always say, if this is your first time joining a foundation webinar, then please be reassured that your cameras and microphones are disabled for the duration and you can safely eat your lunch without fear of being seen or heard. We'd love for you to participate in today's webinar, however, and the best way you can do that is by asking questions via the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. You can put questions into that Q&A function at any point that they occur to you throughout the webinar, and Damien, our moderator for today, will put those questions to our panelists at around about the 12:40 mark. So to today's webinar, we're delighted to have broadcaster Damien Venuto moderating a conversation between Helen Clark, the patron of our foundation, and Shamubeel Eaqub, economist and commentator, who has designed and led our foundation's work on social cohesion in New Zealand. Recently, we released our second annual report, and today's discussion will explore the report's findings and what they tell us about our country in 2026. Over to you, Damien, Helen, and Shamubeel.
Good afternoon, everyone. So the threads that hold our social fabric together are frayed. So today I am, as Murray mentioned, I'm going to be joined by former Prime Minister, the Right Honourable Helen Clark, and economist Shamubeel Eaqub to discuss their second annual report into social cohesion across New Zealand. So thank you, firstly, to everyone for taking the time to join us today. I know that everyone is busy. The economy is hopefully recovering right now. So I'm sure that all of you are incredibly busy at your jobs or with whatever you're doing in life at the moment. So again, it's no small matter that you are joining us. But I think we all agree that this issue really matters to the country, not only today, but also in terms of our ability to withstand volatility that might arrive in the future. These are deeply uncertain times. So at its core, social cohesion is that essential foundation that enables the community to navigate complexity and survive turbulence. It underpins our sense of belonging, our individual worth, and our collective happiness. So when those bonds start to fray, we all feel it. And I think one of the things that we spoke about before we came on air today is this idea that this report validates what a lot of us have been feeling about New Zealand right now. And I think we could end up paying a very big price for ignoring this issue. So what I want to learn today is what we can do to address these issues and how we can move forward as a society. The numbers are in, but what can we actually do about them? So to start, I'd like to hand the discussion over to Shamubeel, who's just going to give us a short rundown of what the latest numbers show and how they compare to previous studies and maybe some international examples too. So Shamubeel, could we bring you in at this point?
Sure. Thank you, Damien. And Damien, thank you for writing that series of stories on stuff as well. I think they gave a human aspect to the numbers that we have been collecting. So just a little bit of the motivation for why I did this work. It was very much around the idea that New Zealand has some pretty big issues that we want to deal with, whether it's climate change or an aging population. These are kind of big issues that we have to deal with. But we are somehow stuck and we're unable to kind of navigate across those differences, holding those different conversations and looking after each other over time. And in my mind, what's making it difficult is the fact that we don't have sufficient social cohesion underneath to be able to have these difficult conversations. So the survey we did was a relatively simple one in that we copied and pasted from Australia, from the Scanlon Foundation survey. And when I went and asked for the money from various people, including Stephen Tyndall, I joked to him, look, I mean, we're going to be at least better than the Aussies, right? I mean, surely. And fortunately for us, when I looked at the survey and what we found in terms of the outcomes is the the measures of social cohesion in New Zealand were a hell of a lot lower than they were in Australia, across pretty much every dimension. And over the last 2 years, we've seen that fall across every dimension as well. So we were measuring it in terms of the sense of belonging, sense of worth, social inclusion and justice, participation, acceptance and rejection of people and ideas. So I think when we look at some of these kinds of things, we also need to understand that while we've only been studying this for a couple of years in our survey, there has been other work that's been going on for a while. And this decline over time is not sudden. We've seen this erosion that has taken place over a period of time. So we kind of talked about it in our report this year. For example, the steady increase in loneliness, reducing belief that multiculturalism is good, reducing trust in our institutions, and conflicted views on how we should make difficult decisions. Should we have authoritarian people or should we have technocratic people? And same, how do we kind of hold the idea of democracy in all of this? So there's a whole bunch of these different pressures that are coming at us. And when we looked at the data this year, what we also found was one of the biggest drivers of why people have such different views was to do with the financial comfort. So it's both a sense of poverty, where people don't have enough time and resources to be able to do everything that they can, but also that inequality. So those big divergences of views depending on how we are experiencing life. So there's a whole bunch of underlying reasons why that's happening. We also saw that there was this almost dogmatic view of politics. If you're of a particular tribe, you thought about it in a particular way. And that means that we're finding it harder to reach across those political differences to make good decisions. We also found that, New Zealand is fractured. So when I look around the world, I see a lot of countries that are quite polarized. So you've got two groups that are really at it with each other. But in New Zealand, it seems a little bit more fractured. So from a data perspective, we kind of see three big groups. About a third of us that are fairly connected, fairly well kind of looked after. We think things are working okay. There's about 40% of us who are, I'd call, ambivalent and in the middle. Things aren't great, but things aren't terrible either. And then there's 30% of us that are actually quite alienated, angry, but also super engaged. So we're finding this kinds of, their characteristics are not what I'd see in other parts of the world. So it feels to me like where we are today is we're a country that's fractured. I think there is a lot of hope, particularly amongst our younger people, and there is a real desire for us to do things differently. So I've been going around the country talking about some of this stuff, and one of the most fascinating things for me has been around just one, how much engagement there has been. So I've had hundreds of people turn up to events in Christchurch and Wellington, and the questions inevitably are around one, a reflection that, yeah, it kind of describes what I'm seeing in society, but two, I really, really want to know, what can I do about it? And that to me is a really encouraging question, because it's not what somebody else is going to do, but what can I do? So I think maybe if anybody's interested, please have a look at the report. There is a whole bunch of data and insight in there, but that hopefully gives you just a little bit of a starting summary of the kinds of things that I'm seeing and some of the mood that I'm sensing across New Zealand.
Thanks for that, Shamubeel. So what I'd like to do right now is start with that bigger picture. Like, when social cohesion starts to erode, what does it actually look like in a country? What are some of the international warning signs that we should be looking out for? And what are some of the things that maybe we can recognize in New Zealand and perhaps even in our own behavior when we have that erosion of social cohesion?
To me, it feels like when we start shouting at each other rather than sitting down together to actually figure out how we work together. And social cohesion is sometimes misconstrued as us all being the same. I think that's absolutely not true. For me, social cohesion is about we have enough trust and understanding of each other that we're able to meet across difference, hold difficult conversations, and make decisions that last the distance. I think by all accounts, we're not doing that at the moment. What we're doing is we have dogmatic ideological ways of doing things. We flip-flop on policies. We are shouting at each other to convince each other of our views. But none of those things are particularly useful in getting those consistent big changes that are good for society. So it feels like we're kind of fighting for individuals rather than the commons.
Helen, last time we spoke, you mentioned that during your time as Prime Minister, it was far easier to walk across the aisle, talk to somebody who was from a different political party, and get them on board with big ideas that could maybe help New Zealand move forward. You've also recognized that perhaps that isn't as easy these days. So, what's your view on how the level of conversation at a political level has changed in over the last couple of decades?
I think there's no doubt we're much more polarised, and the discourse is very, very partisan, with some exceptions. One of the reasons the Helen Clark Foundation was set up was to support evidence-based approach to policy, which most governments with any common sense could pick up. And we've seen with a lot of work we've done on, for example, infrastructure issues, where New Zealand's wasted an awful lot of money, where one side explores something, costs a lot of money, the other side comes in, dumps it, starts something else, costs a lot of money. This is hopeless. So we've started to see some recognition on both sides that this has to stop, and that we have to buy into longer term thinking. And Parliament has before it right now, support for the Infrastructure Commission plan, which has got broad support. So that's a bit of progress, and I'd like to see more of that in more areas, whether it's the future of the New Zealand Superannuation Fund or climate change policy, because the constant seesaw. You expect some change with a change of government, of course. There are differences, but there's things we should be able to stick at. And I think the constant turbulence, going back over quite a number of years now, has been very destabilising for people, because you don't know what a government's going to do. What they said they'd do may be the last thing they're going to do. I recall going into government in 1999, and trust was quite low then in government because of the breaking your word, breaking your promise phenomena that had gone on for close to 20 years before that. But we got some trust back at that time, that if you said you were going to do something, you'd do it. And if you specifically said you weren't going to do something, you wouldn't do it. But I think we're at a point again now where people don't really quite know what to expect. It's very destabilising. And then you're looking at this against the background of tremendous economic insecurity for many people. When you slash public service jobs to the extent that's happened, that ricochets right through the economy. Ask any restaurant or cafe owner, particularly in Wellington. People know that artificial intelligence is coming. They don't know whether their job's going to be safe from that. Are they going to have to re-educate, retool? Who's going to pay for that? Let's not even start on house prices right now, which are down. But there's a lot of things making people feel very, very uncomfortable. And I think it's in many ways, it's as bad as I've seen in my lifetime. I think the period around 91, 92, 93, when there was very savage cuts in public spending and unemployment went high, that was a bad time, and you might have got similar results then. But we're not often in the state, and the issue is, can we get out of it this time as we have in the past?
Helen, you regularly advise leaders abroad and speak to leaders abroad. Are these issues New Zealand specific, or are they also quite present in the international context?
They're quite present. I do think that we have seen our living standards slip somewhat further than many. Think for example, of before Spain, Portugal, Greece joined the EU. They were the poor countries of Europe. Their standard of living exceeds ours now. We've been on a downward track, and that desperately needs to be changed. But in general, populations are pretty unhappy at the moment. Look at the UK.
Yeah.
Government goes from hero to zero within barely a year, and 2 years in, it's looking like curtains. And what we're seeing is the rise of the populist right, if you like. Take an election today in the UK, a serious prospect that Nigel Farage could be Prime Minister. Take an election today in Australia, it might be Pauline Hanson. Our equivalent's Winston, who's closing in on the Prime Minister in terms of preferred PM. In France, you've got the Le Pen party, sort of neo-fascist, as it were. You've got Vox in Spain. I mean, there's the equivalence of this all over, and we won't even start on the United States of America. So people are unhappy. Cost of living pressures are everywhere. Housing is not just an issue in New Zealand. It's Australia. It's Britain. It's everywhere. People are feeling the pain. And then this overall picture of job insecurity, what's AI going to mean? People have got a lot on their minds.
There was a piece in The Atlantic published last week with the headline, How did Britain become as poor as Mississippi in the US? And you look at some of the issues that have happened over there, and it comes down to stalemates in government. It comes down to an unwillingness to invest in infrastructure, and it comes down to these issues being allowed to continue over decades. And it felt in some ways as if it was a warning to New Zealand. I felt like that article, when I read it, it felt a little bit like a warning to New Zealand.
Definitely a warning to New Zealand. And of course, Brexit was the biggest self-inflicted wound since the Suez Canal invasion, or some say since the loss of the American colonies in the 18th century. But it's monumental what that has done to British standard of living. They went from being an integral part of one of the world's wealthiest markets to being on their own, and it's cost them dearly. So political populism, and that was what that was about, can be very, very costly to the standard of living. And then, as Shamubeel emphasises so much in the report, poverty, not feeling well off. This is an enormous driver of poor social cohesion.
Shamubeel, so in the report, just to pick up on that theme over there, 45% of New Zealanders now believe that hard work no longer pays off. Is that a sign of that basic economic contract just fizzing away, and the idea that a fair go, the Kiwi idea of a fair go, is that officially broken?
I think people feel like that contract has been broken. And I think that was a very big part of what was built after the Second World War in New Zealand. I think that was kind of the way that we had built up the idea of what it means to belong in New Zealand, that there would be this support network, that there would be opportunities. And if you worked hard, you'd be able to access those ladders of opportunities. But I think now it feels to a lot of people like you are working hard, but you're still poor. And, when I talk to people in food banks, for example, I hear about people turning up in high vis. They're clearly in work, but they still need handouts to be able to feed their families. There's a real loss of dignity when you say, your ticket to success is to get a job and to provide for your family. But when that job no longer provides for your family, it becomes a real source of indignity. And I feel like that's part of it, is there is this element of it. But I also want to kind of inject just a little bit of hope, because I'm such a depressing kind of person otherwise. When I've been going around the country, what I've been seeing is, despite having high unemployment in many of our provincial towns, there are also businesses that have vacancies. And then what it feels to me like is there is this mismatch between the opportunities that exist and the need that's there. And I think that's where the social contract has failed. I don't think it's a loss of opportunity, full stop. That's our problem. I think we have failed to kind of create the glue in between, the connections in between, to be able to bring that back. So that's where social cohesion to me is so important. I think we still have time in New Zealand. And I know Helen kind of talked about, can we still win it back? And I hope we can. That's what I want us to work on, is I feel like we still have those ingredients, those ladders of opportunity still exist, but they just feel like they're out of grasp. And if we can just work together a little bit more, those things can come together. So it feels like a long-winded answer to your question, Damien, but only because to me, it feels like it's more complicated than just saying the dream is dead. I think the dream is still possible, but just not within grasp.
It almost becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy, because if we tell ourselves long enough that there is no opportunity in New Zealand, there are no jobs in New Zealand, that becomes the prophecy that's then fulfilled by the fact that we don't look for those opportunities and we don't know where to find them. So there is this risk that we become our own worst enemies too, right?
Totally.
Absolutely. Yeah. And just to say that, in economies, confidence is everything. So if you don't have confidence, you don't spend. The money doesn't go around. It's very, very debilitating. And we're in a bit of that state at the moment. Look, for example, at the state of bars, restaurants, entertainment in Auckland. Auckland's not on the front line of the public sector cuts, but there you have this tremendous loss of confidence. People are being very, very careful. So, as Shamubeel says, we have to live in hope that we can get this back. But we are seeing in this survey that we're not living up to our self-image. So many people saying they can't get ahead. Only 45% see New Zealand as a land of opportunity. It was always a land of opportunity.
So it's the reason why people from the UK came here.
Exactly. It's the reason, my forebears got on boats and sailed 12,000 miles away, never to go back, because there was nothing for them in Britain. But they thought a fresh start here, and that's kind of gone.
So, Helen, to drill into that a little bit, that feeling that New Zealand is no longer a place of a fair go, do you think that comes down to stagnant wages, or is it about something bigger, something broader, or can we use housing affordability as a means to explain that? What is making people feel that system is rigged at the moment?
So it is this feeling that you can't get ahead. I'm working harder than ever, but my wages are static. I can't afford a house. I'm relying on the bank of mum and dad. I think they also do look at political decisions and priorities. And, obviously we know that one of the first things current government did was weight the tax scales back in favour of landlords again. And yet people look at other decisions. They look, for example, at the moment, this total mobility scheme, which has helped people with disabilities get access to taxi transport to take them to essential appointments and so on. That's being cut. So I think, where's the fairness here? And you could use any number of examples. Those are just two that are in stark contrast. But there's a feeling that this is loaded. This is not working in the public interest. It's not working for me. It might be working for some people, but it's not working for me.
And we also have this period of high inflation where it feels like it's been really difficult to keep up, and wages just haven't been growing at the same time, right, Shamubeel?
Yeah, so it's been that weird kind of inflation. We're not used to this kind of inflation, certainly in the current generation. So much of the cost of living has been in things that we can't avoid. So it's been the cost of rates, insurance, food, electricity.
Shamubeel, we're just losing your audio a little bit there. Is anyone else picking that up?
Yep, just shut it a bit.
Yeah, so maybe try again.
Yeah, so look, absolutely. So the big issue for cost of living is so much of it has been around the things you can't avoid: rates, insurance, electricity, food, and that's had a really big impact on people's ability to afford things.
So, Shamubeel, one thing that I enjoyed in the report was there were these areas where it felt that there were contradictions in the data. So the group of people who are experiencing arguably the worst social cohesion outcomes are young people, those under the age of 30. So nearly 2/3 feel isolated. They're feeling lonely. 40% are skipping meals. I'm going to repeat that because that stat feels incredibly important to me. 40% of these people are skipping meals because they don't have enough money to pay for food. Yet, now this is where it becomes interesting. They are also documented as the most hopeful and aspirational age group. How can we explain the generation that's structurally struggling the most but hasn't given up hope? And how do we harness that optimism? That optimism feels really important.
It is. And I think that, to me, that was probably the most surprising thing out of the survey is I thought those who were not experiencing good social cohesion would be the ones who would also be less hopeful about the future. But what we found in the survey was young people, by and large, had very strong ideals. They wanted to do things better. They wanted to see improvements. And that's a very powerful signal, right? When you think about the changes that we need to make, it has to be changes that last the distance. And it is going to be those young people, that next generation, that's going to carry this over the future. But I don't think they can do it on their own. So much of what we have enjoyed in our generation has been because of investments that were made by previous generations. And so to me, the invitation here was we can't be complacent. Those of us who have enjoyed the fruits of past investments, it's time for us to step up, because what I saw also in the data is those of us who enjoyed those good times are not yet willing to pay it forward. So if we do pay it forward, I think the intent, the hopefulness is absolutely there. So those two things in my mind are kind of the indications. The young people don't have the resources yet, but those of us who do, if we're willing to pay it forward, if we're willing to invest for the future, I think we do have a chance at making things better.
I think the thing that shouldn't be lost here too is that things can change in a single generation. One thing that I think about quite often is the Chilean shift from the dictatorship to a democratic government happened over the course of a single election where they voted no. And that was inspired by the optimism of young people who wanted to see a different Chile. And I think that stories like that, they provide a powerful message about how systems can change and how optimism can play an incredibly powerful role in shifting those systems. Helen, have you ever seen that in politics in your experience?
Optimism, yes, but what I think we have to be concerned about is falling political participation, because if people think that everything's hopeless and their vote won't make a difference, the rate of voting goes down. We know there's very low rates of voting in the United States, for example. In many countries, we used to have higher rates, but there is much greater disengagement now. So I think, obviously, we're a few months out for a general election, and the call has to be participate. There's no point moaning or complaining later. Participate. Take an interest in what parties are saying. Vote for what you think is for the good of the country. But if we disengage, if we don't have optimism, we're never going to turn around this rather sad state of affairs.
So can I add there, Damien? Yes. Because I think when it comes to participation, I think, yes, absolutely, we should participate in those civic duties like voting. But in my mind, there's also an element of much more grassroots participation in community. And it's those two things together that create, that better citizenship. And the way that I see it is that retreat that we have seen from the public sphere is quite problematic. It's part of the reason why we can't see the value of our participation. Those things like those insulating layers like churches, sporting clubs, local clubs, all those things that many of us participated in our younger days, they're far less prevalent now than they used to be. And those insulating layers are really powerful, because when you come together for a shared reason, shared purpose, it's so much easier to have that meeting across other differences. And you're much more able to do things from each other. You can see people across difference. And in our report, we talked a little bit about some of the lessons from the UK. And a lot of it was that participation in things like community gardens or language classes or repair workshops, those were actually the most successful things that created more cohesion in the community. And it was much more about those repeated, meaningful interactions that was really quite powerful. So absolutely agree, Helen, that we need to have those participations in those big things like voting. But because people are losing trust in those institutions of government and elections, I think we also need to start investing back in those community things, because that's where we have so much of those powerful things. And it's so easy to do, right? In almost every community, we have volunteer organization, we have community organizations, we have clubs, we have things you can volunteer to, you can participate in, even if you're just there alongside each other. That's still powerful. So
we do, but you've also got to have the time to do it. And a lot of people
and this is where the poverty is so hard.
Yeah,
very long the economic issue is so big.
A long distance, and then you've got to have the capacity to participate when you've got a lot of other costs. So if we felt better off, then probably our level of engagement in community would increase as well.
Yeah, because that was so, Helen. But I guess the challenge was, even amongst our well-off people, we're not participating as much. So that participation in society has just diminished. We've kind of retreated into these private spaces and private spheres, which I find really fearful, because, so much of the fun happens when you're in the public commons. And yet we're kind of losing some of that, even amongst those people who are well off. So I feel like there is a tension there. You're absolutely correct that you have to have the capacity, but we also have to have the willingness, and those institutions need to be sustained for us to be able to do it.
And the truth is, some of those we would class as well off. They're also on a grindstone, right?
Yeah.
You think of the young lawyers, you might know the hours they put in, young professionals, etc. So, yeah, we're on treadmills, And we probably need a moment to reflect on, what the purpose of life here is. And the purpose of life in the end is health and happiness to me. And how do we create the conditions for that in New Zealand?
There's a great piece that I read a little while back about how true privilege is the ability to sit down and do nothing. Exactly. And that it's this rare opportunity that only a small group of us have.
Yeah. True.
Helen, you've just mentioned how hard young lawyers work. Now, perhaps it's because I studied law at university. It's something that worries me quite tremendously, but the trust in our courts has drifted from around 57% down to 45%. That was one of the biggest drops that I saw across any of the metrics in the report. So how worrying is it that people no longer trust the legal system?
It's fundamental, isn't it? Because the concept of a court is to dispense justice.
Yeah.
So if you think you're appearing at a court and you're not going to be fairly treated, that's pretty challenging. And I would have thought the courts were probably one of the last bastions in a sense, but that's clearly not what this evidence is suggesting to us. Again, they may be caught up in the broader feeling that the system just doesn't work for me. So I don't have trust in the courts. I don't have trust in the government to do the right thing. I'm really sour on the system here. I think that the courts are collateral damage in that overall perception.
Helen, and when you look at that breakdown of trust across institutions, across politics, one shocking figure that came up in the report was that 38% of New Zealanders aged under 30 now toy or support the idea of a strong leader that can bypass Parliament to get things done. How alarmed are you by this idea that people are almost accommodating anti-democratic ideals when it comes to their thinking right now off the back of this breakdown in social cohesion? I suppose we can see that a little bit with Trump in the US. We can see that with what's increasingly looking likely with Nigel Farage in the UK. What do you think? Where do you think this places New Zealand? Is that a dangerous place for us to be when 38% of young New Zealanders like the idea of a strongman figure almost stepping in and taking control?
A very dangerous place to be. The teaching of history is pretty thin in our school system these days. So I suspect most people have no idea of where the strongman syndrome has led us in the past. Do you want Stalin back? Do you want Hitler back? Do you want to? And there's any number of strong men leaders around the world today who make life pretty miserable for their populations. So wake up call, we need more civics education about the importance of our institutions, our democracy, values of tolerance, respect, listening to each other, debate without rancor. There's something not going well here. I think the polarization is also driven by social media, which tends to, drag people down a certain line of thought. And populism, this kind of, quote, soft fascism, which can become hard fascism, which has exists in our own political system and elsewhere. It's very worrying.
Helen, how do you challenge that? Because especially when you look at young men, particularly right now, they feel like the system is leaving them behind. They seem quite combative. There's an entire movement against the concept of empathy, which I find quite hilarious because I've never felt that humans need any encouragement to be less empathetic. But now you have a group of people who are encouraging others to be less empathetic. How do you combat this when you have these other movements that are growing online, becoming incredibly strong and becoming incredibly persuasive to the very people that need to be reminded of the power of democracy and the importance of democratic value?
Some of the polling that's been done about the attitudes of young men in a range of societies towards women and women's equality, the rights of women, this is also pretty troubling. So I don't have the answers or insights here, but young men's feelings towards me as a woman, to women in general. I think this is speaking to something deeper that's going on, some greater alienation, perhaps also in the background some kind of resentment that is, if women do better, men do worse. But this is not a zero-sum game. When women do better, we all do better. But getting that point across obviously hasn't been easy. Pay regard to the young men in your family, and the influences that they're subjected to would be my advice.
Yeah. Shamubeel, there does also seem to be a little bit of a risk that we're turning on each other in other ways. So, I mean, you have old versus young, you have men versus women, you have right versus left. What do you make of the fact that fewer than 1 in 2 Kiwis today think that immigrants make good citizens? How does that compare to other countries? And what's going wrong here? How do we fix that?
Yeah, I mean, that's a fairly personal one. You can see how I look. The reality is that people kind of say things about immigration that I think is, in the survey, what we found was the attitudes towards immigration is hardening very fast. Not just in New Zealand, but around the world, including in Australia. And we saw that in terms of the protest marches in Australia, the violence that we've seen in Ireland recently, in the UK in recent years. So this is not an isolated thing to New Zealand. But yeah, in New Zealand, less than half of us think that immigrants make good citizens. In Australia, it's over 80%. But we have to make a distinction. It's not all immigrants that New Zealand resent. So when it comes to things like, people from the UK or Japan, people are comfortable with that. But if it's people from China or India, they're less comfortable with it. So I think there is a thin veneer that we hide behind when we talk about immigration. Really, what we're talking about, I think, is racism. And there is a rise of racism here that is troubling, just given our history of immigration in New Zealand, right? I mean, we're a country that's built on immigration. And now we are really, I think, losing that social license to use immigration as an economic and political tool. And that makes it much, much harder for us, I think, to be able to respond to some of the pressures that are coming down the pipe. If you think about our aging population, the easiest way to smooth some of that burden is to use a little bit of immigration, so then we have enough workers, we have enough population growth to smooth that out. But if these kinds of attitudes harden, then we won't be able to do that. And any change we get is going to be quite dramatic and, I think, quite volatile.
Helen, the one thing that came out of the report that I found quite interesting was that a massive 80% of us still believe in democracy. So despite this underlying issue with growing belief in a strongman, there is still a very high standard of belief in democracy. But the trust in our government at the same time has plummeted to around 39%. So how do you bridge that gap between belief in democracy and then belief in the people who have been elected to uphold that democracy?
So clearly the trust in government is not great in this survey. It's 39% think you can trust them to do the right thing, most of the time. And the proposition that government works fine as it is, only 12% agreed with that. So there's a lot of distrust. On the other hand, as you say, the fact that there's still a strong belief in democracy is encouraging. Let's hope it's backed up by high participation. I think one thing we need to reflect on is that, flawed as things are here at the moment, we still have a right to free speech. You can get out there and put your opinions, and I mean, I don't support hate speech of any kind, but we can have quite strong opinions about things. The United States of America we looked up to as a bastion of free speech, and we're seeing that eroded in so many ways. You're a foreign student who happens to, pick up a flag for a cause the administration doesn't believe in, you lose your permit. Green card holders seeing status removed because of what they've said or written on their social media or whatever. So to me, it's a very precious thing that we can say what we think here without fear of retaliation. And that's something that can't be taken for granted in a lot of Western countries now. The United Kingdom, for example, branded a group which managed to pop over a simple fence and get into a military base and paint some slogans or something, branded them as terrorists. And then anybody who supported them was branded as a terrorist. A whole lot of elderly people went and sat in Trafalgar Square and held up signs saying they supported this particular group, and the police, one by one, went in, picked them up, put them in paddy wagons and took them away. I mean, what is this? This is Britain, the land of the Magna Carta. So, my little bit of hope here is that we can still say what we think, and we don't expect to knock on the door to be told that we're being branded a terrorist or something for having an opinion.
Yeah, it's quite terrifying now too that when you go through US immigration, they ask for your social media handles. They want to be sure that they can see what you've said online, as if this is some great threat to their society or their way of being. So you do have all these little things that are happening that show that in a very short space of time, rules and orders that were established over decades can whittle away and be degraded relatively quickly.
Yep. So let's value what we've got.
So what we're going to do now is just hand it over to a few of the Q&As that have come in. So we've got 44 questions, and we certainly won't have enough time to run through all of those. Shamubeel and Helen definitely have some other appointments this afternoon, so I won't keep them that long. But there's a really good question here from Mike Colville. And he says, how can we expect social cohesion when our political system is motivated by polarization in order to win an election? What came first, the polarized government or society? So there are a couple of things in there. The first thing is, it points to the short cycles of our government and the fact that it's really hard to have long-term thinking when everything's driven by the short term. So Helen, how do you combat that?
Well, I suspect if you went to a referendum on extending the term of Parliament, you may well get the same result that happened in 1990, because when trust in government is low, the public's not going to want to give a longer license to rule, as it were, and the longer term was decisively voted down in 1990. The truth is, the short political cycle, you've got to know what you're doing. You've got to get cracking. Not all governments know how to do that, unfortunately, and to use the 3 years that they've got. But I think also we've seen almost impulsive decision making. We've seen decision making almost out of spite that something's overturned because someone else did it. We see this in the US and elsewhere as well. So yeah, the question is right. None of this drives social cohesion, because we see things that are probably quite good in nature being trashed because somebody else thought of them.
We also had a discussion in the newsroom the other day about whether question time is still useful, because it does just feel like people basically lobbing rocks at each other from different sides of the political house. There's no interest in or moving forward the debate. There was this Swiss academic who wrote that if you haven't thought about the 6 counter arguments to your view, then you are driven by ideology. You aren't driven by an informed view. And I do wonder if there's been a breakdown in our willingness to get to that point where we have an informed view on something rather than just an ideology.
I'm a great defender of question time, by the way, and I think it still does more or less work here. I was in the Australian Parliament a couple of years ago. They have a shocking question time. The opposition gets to ask a question and the government can drone on for 3 minutes and reply, and there's no follow-up question. That's absolutely hopeless. The British House of Commons, of course, has a very robust question time as well, with more spontaneity to it. There's too much reading of questions here. But nonetheless, the public seeing that ministers are being held to account in Parliament, I think is important.
So, Shamubeel, this is a question for you from Bella Atkins that I really like. If people feel the economic system is becoming less fair, can community cohesion realistically improve the situation without addressing the underlying distribution of opportunities, wealth, and security?
Yeah, and I think that's the kind of the tension, I think also what Helen was talking about, that top down versus bottom up. So when I look at the top down, I think our economic system, our rules and regulations, they seem to have forgotten that it's there for the people. that fundamentally the reason why we have all of this is so then more people in New Zealand can have better lives. That's what we want to do, right? And yet I don't think that's true anymore. We seem to kind of have this weird kind of idea of what an economy is, that somehow is this thing that's apart from the people that it serves. So I think there is a real issue there. But underneath that, when I go and see where the economy actually takes place in communities, where it's real businesses, with people who own the businesses, people who work in them, I think you can have situations where those things can work together. So I think it's still possible for us to recover a lot of this. When I see locally owned businesses that prioritize looking after their staff rather than just the profits, it's an and rather than an or. When I see local communities working together to create pathways for education, for training into jobs, I see people kind of looking after people who fall off the employment market for whatever reason. There's a whole bunch of things that I think you see in communities that can create that social cohesion, that safety net. And I think for a long time we thought that the state would provide that safety net and that ability for us to be resilient. But I do not think that exists anymore. I think the reforms of the 80s through successive governments have hollowed out that safety net, that resilience in communities. And if we are to reinvent some of those, I think we have to build local up. I don't think there is a clear, strong ideology of equity and redistribution that will be agreed on broadly that's going to do it all for the whole community.
Helen, here's a really good question for you from Tony Mayo. He says that local government is undergoing a forced amalgamation right now. What should be the role of local government in strengthening social cohesion and democracy, and how can democracy be retained in this amalgamation?
Well, kia ora, Tony, who was at university with me. We go back a way. Yes, look, clearly there's been amalgamations before. Michael Bassett's Local Government Act of 1989 reduced hundreds of local authorities to 81 or whatever. And then my government set up the Royal Commission, which in the end led to decisions being made by the next government on amalgamation in Auckland. But there are some odd things happening at the moment. I'm very concerned about the abolition of regional councils without proper discussion, because that's where your capacity is to do the environmental regulation. And if you take that down to more smaller units of local government, obviously not all have the ability to deal with that effectively. Local government is extremely important. Our community boards are important. Again, in the community my father lived the latter part of his life in, I see the suggestion of forced amalgamation of community boards, but the community is quite specific, isn't it? It doesn't go over 50 miles. Mm-hmm. So if your board's put in with another one a long distance away, that's not really going to cut it for you. So I think some of this change is a bit rushed and not really very well thought through. And local government can be that level of government that people most relate to.
Here's a question for both Shamubeel and Helen, and it comes from Catherine Arrow. So, given that the study was done in late 2025, have you since taken into consideration any of the major shifts in circumstances in the last 6 months? So it now seems that economic hardship is greater, division is greater, and the study at this moment doesn't seem to consider the role that leaders play in creating those circumstances by using language that's both dismissive, denigrating, and dividing through mainstream and social media and in Parliament. So I think there are two elements to this question. It's what impact do you think that the last 6 months, where we've seen the fuel crisis, we've seen the volatility in the US, we've seen businesses clamping down, what impact do you think that that's had in social cohesion? And then the second part is, do we need to take greater consideration of the role that politicians play in dismantling social cohesion through their language?
So I think it probably suggests that the next survey could be worse. Because even if the boats start flowing through the Straits of Hormuz tomorrow, if something's signed, it's going to take ages for stable supply to return, and it's easier for prices to go up than to go down, really. So the next survey may not be pretty reading either. But I mean, the role of leaders is important. One point that's been made in the chat on screen here is on the threats to media, the threats to the independence of media, who among us doesn't have a thought that what's happening at Radio New Zealand isn't some kind of vindictiveness for getting a hard interview? The PM's not speaking to the morning TV host of the public media channel. So I think there are pressures on our media, and you're on a slide in a democracy when that happens.
Shamubeel, this isn't really one in the economic space, but I feel like it might be one that you're interested in. So this question comes from Jackie Long, and she says that much of the work or her work focuses on recovery and well-being, but the report reinforces that people recover in communities, not in isolation. What gives you confidence that New Zealand can strengthen social cohesion again? And what role do you see community organizations playing in that journey? And I want to add just a little bit to that question, because is there any possibility of us reducing that level of isolation when we have so many people that are now using digital communication or digital technology as a means by which to isolate themselves from everyone else while creating the illusion that they are connected to others?
Yeah, what a wonderful question. And it's multifaceted. So to start with, in terms of that recovery and rehabilitation, community organizations are extremely powerful. In fact, they're the ones who make it possible. So like Helen said, democracy or any of the services happen in the community. They do not happen at some, theoretical level in Wellington. So in reality, these community organizations, these local efforts that really make a big difference. And yet those are the same organizations that are under increasing stress from lack of funding, reduced number of volunteers, and all those other bits and pieces. So I won't say I hold extraordinary confidence that everything will be fine. I think those are the critical organizations and institutions that are needed to knit back social cohesion, but I'm not confident that we will get that right. When I kind of sort of think about the way forward from here, it really is kind of thinking about, when we think about participation in community, what does that actually look like? Is it performative, like a consultation or something else? Or is it true? Is it deep, where we are actually having that shared interaction? And Damien, you talked about before, is do we have the space to be able to talk to each other, to actually learn the facts, to understand the depth of the expertise, then be those active citizens to participate in that stuff? So I don't know what the answer is here, other than to say, look, I feel like we still have some of that infrastructure. It is really important, but it is not as strong as it used to be. And if we want to rebuild our communities, I think that is where it's going to come from.
Helen, this is a good one for you. And it's something that came up in the comment section quite a lot when I've been writing about social cohesion. So this one comes from Kathy Livermore, and I apologize if I mispronounced the surname over there, but she says, I notice that these conversations continue to exist in a disassociated state of universalism while ignoring the roots of Western colonial cultural beliefs and the systems related that reflect that ideology and its continuation into neoliberal capitalism. I suggest that until we have a real cultural conversation identifying the values enacted through our society, then we can't address the causes of social incohesion. It feels insane to hear people talk about the issues without identifying the root. So I suppose the question here is, what role do you think that neoliberal capitalism plays in the continuation of the decline of social cohesion? And I'd like to frame this in the context of a column from Simon Wilson recently, where he mentioned that both Labour and National seem to be neoliberal fundamentally because they believe New Zealand should have a low level of debt rather than investing too greatly in structural change or the structural changes that we need. So are we getting something wrong here? Is neoliberalism to blame for some of the problems?
Well, it's the old story, isn't it? That as much market as is necessary, as much social justice as is possible. You need that balance, and I think at its worst, neoliberalism tilted the balance to the market, forgetting that markets don't serve all members of the community well. You can't leave housing to the market. You can't leave income for all to the market, because the market doesn't work in the interests of everyone. It works in the interest of what is profitable and what goes well. So you have to have that balance, and the more successful social democracies find a way of having vibrant economies, but also very vibrant public sector, social security, etc. We were there once. We've gone away from that quite a lot, I feel. I mean, one of the things that was a feature of my government was that we did pay down a lot of debt, and that meant that when New Zealand went into the financial crisis, let alone the pandemic years later, we were in quite a strong position with government books. So I wouldn't identify low levels of debt with, quote, neoliberalism. If you can pay down in the good years, you should, because bad years inevitably come along with the cycle. But the key point I would make is, in the end, it's all about people. If what we're doing isn't serving people, then what are we in it for?
Yeah.
We're not here to serve markets. We're here to serve people in public life, and never forget that.
I think, can I just add to that, Damien, because I think that's a really good question. And the way I think about it is, we've kind of oversimplified our view of how the economy works and society works. That somehow the invisible hand of the market works in every instance, when even though the entire study of economics pretty much starts with the assumption that this is not true, but we'll study it this way and then figure out why it doesn't work. And as a result, I think we've taken a hyper individual, hyper short term, and a very shallow understanding of how things work. So our conversation, public conversations, I think, are rooted in very kind of dismissive assessments and then assertions. And so I think it's a very superficial conversation that's going on. So even when it comes to debt, for example, it's not debt per se that's a problem, but if you're borrowing money to essentially indefinitely fund operations, that's a bad thing, right? You should not be putting groceries on Afterpay if you can afford to. So, but there is this other part of it, and which I think Helen touched on, is yes, there's the invisible hand of the market, and it's actually a very powerful force. You can harness it for lots of things, but there's also this invisible fabric of community. That's what it's there for. That's what allows you to look after people. I think it's the second that we have lost sight of, and social cohesion is kind of that nerdy way of talking about that invisible fabric of community. That's the bit that allows us to look after each other, to lift those up who've fallen off. It's that bit that allows us to care for people. And I have this conversation all the time when I'm giving talks around the country, is never forget that when we talk about the economy, we're talking about people.
That's right.
I had this subtle sense of trepidation about even asking that question, but I'm so happy I did, because I feel like that is a wonderful place to leave this discussion. I'd like to thank everyone who's attended the conference today. It's been fantastic. I feel every time I talk to Shamubeel and Helen, I feel like I learn so much. And as a journalist who asks questions for a living, you can wish for nothing better than being able to learn from these discussions. So I appreciate your time, both of you, and Murray for setting everything up and for saving me from myself, from my own technological ineptitude. So I appreciate that. I'll hand it back to Murray now.
Happy to help, Damien. Thanks so much for your expert moderation today, and Helen and Shamubeel for your insights on the concerning state of social cohesion in New Zealand in 2026 and what we might collectively do about that. Thank you to everyone who joined today. We hope to see you back here on Monday, 29 June for a discussion on trade policy with Todd McLean and Damien O'Connor, current and former Ministers of Trade. We also hope to see you back here during July, when we'll host a series of webinars exploring the issues in the book Facing Up to the Future, which is now available on pre-order. So keep an eye out for information on those webinars in your inbox. This is over the coming weeks. But for now, thanks for tuning in to today's webinar, and have a great afternoon.